Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of Garage Biljon. In this episode, we are going to continue working on the rear suspension. And as I said in the previous episode, I did this drum off camera, and I was expressing the hope that this will be a bit easier. But if you guys look closely, you'll see the evidence that this was not easier. This one was even worse than the first one I did. Right, so in the previous video I said I was going to drop this rear axle to re-index the torsion bars. However, I've now, after some research, learned that this is not the best way of tackling this job. So what the factory manual says is when you are re-indexing the rear, you need to take a measurement on the dorsal. And for this you need a special VW tool. I'll show you what that looks like. This is the tool. It's basically a very complex level. But what it does is it gives you an degrees of level that the suspension needs to go up or down. Okay, so I think I now understand better how I need to lift the suspension on the 94. This is the lift kit that I got from the United States that I had made specially for me. What this does is this goes under the strut tower, and it's going to lift the car by give or take 4 centimeters or 2 inches. So what I need to do is I need to first lift the front of the car. Once I've lifted the front of the car, I need to drop the car off the lift and then take a level, pop it down there and measure the difference of the incline that I've created. That difference in incline is what's going to tell me how much I should re-index this rear torsion bar. So, in order for me to do that job, I first have to finish rebuilding the bearings and the brakes at the back. Because then I can put the wheels back on, lift the suspension, measure the incline, drop the rear axle, and then continue from there. So, in this episode, we are going to finish that. So it's going to be wheel bearings, it's going to be brakes. All right, so let's get going with those brakes. All right, so as you can see, I took an angle grinder to this nut that sat on there. I do have a replacement half shaft that I got from a friend of mine who breaks 924s. So that was only €25. A single blade that I used on the multi-tool to cut through this was already €80. So I figured in the end it's cheaper to just buy a shaft than to try and save a shaft but spend €40 on blades. The brake shoes are off, the drum is off, everything is off, so the only thing left in here is the slave cylinder. So what I'll be doing now is I'll be taking this all apart. I will be giving this a coat of paint because this is quite badly corroded on both sides, and I think it'll just be a bit nicer if it's all painted up. But what I'll do now, I'm going to just loosen these 4 bolts and then we'll start taking apart the rest of this braking system. All right. As you can see, I've got the back plate off, I've got the brake line off, I have the handbrake line off, and I have the plate in my hands. So what I've done is I've run the wire wheel over it. It still looks a bit crusty, but you can see it's most of the rust is off. Where it has suffered the most is here where the handbrake cable comes in. I might have to actually sand it down or file it down because it's quite a sharp edge. So I think I'll do that before I degrease it. And then what I've done, I have bought a new can of Hammerite, but this time heat resistant. So this is what you normally use on fireplaces. And then I'll give it a coat of Hammerite and it should be okay, I think. Alright, so I've now filed it down with my little Dremel knockoff from the Lidl. Works perfectly, by the way, and it's on batteries, which is awesome. But I've now filed it off, so now I can run my finger over this without getting hurt. I think I can now degrease it and then I'll give it a lick of paint. Alright, so that looks really good. I'll let this dry. Alright, so let me take you through the things we're going to need to rebuild. The brakes, we've got the plate. It's now nicely painted with hammerite, so it should not be rusting anymore in the next year or so. I have new castle nuts. I have new cotter pins. This is a wheel bearing set up to 85 for a steel arm. I have new springs and things for both sides as well. And in here we have the new drum, looking all spiffy. I will not be putting it on the car like this. I'll be giving it a coat of primer, again to protect it from rusting. And in there we've got the brake shoes. So that means it's time for me to remove this half shaft. First job will be to loosen the nuts on the drive shaft. There's 6 of them, so I'll get that done. Then we'll push this guy out that way, and then we'll pull out all the bearings on all the races, and then I'll be putting in that used one and all the bearings, and we can start building up again. So we're at the back of the half shaft where the drive shaft connects to the half shaft, and I was expecting this to be an Allen head bolt, but it looks like it's a triple square, which I guess means someone's been in here before. Luckily I've got one on hand, one of these, often confused with a Torx head, but it's not. It's got many more little bits, if you can see. So that's why it's called a triple square, because it's actually got 16 of these little things. I'm now going to get this on there with my impact wrench, and then hopefully just quickly get this all off, and then we can pull the shaft out. Okay guys, so I managed to get 5 of the 6 off. This guy is stuck. I'll get my breaker bar on this, and maybe then I'll be able to free it up. Wish me luck. So my breaker bar doesn't quite fit, but I think, yes, my torque wrench was good enough. So this should in theory be the last step. Yes, she's loose. So now we should be able to pry this guy off the stub axle, and then we can finally remove the damaged stub axle. One thing I've learned with these cars is you have to have a lot of patience. Sometimes it goes quite fluidly and quicker than you think, and other times it can take forever. Alright, so as you can see, I've got the drive shaft off, and I've got that stub axle halfway pulled out. I'll just pull it out all the way, and then we can start taking out the bearings that are sitting in there. So half of the bearings have already fallen out, as you can see. Some of these spacers and inner races, I've got one lying in there as well. They just all come off as you pull out this axle. The one I'll be having to push out is the one that's sitting back there, and I'll use a hammer and a drift to do that. So if you look here, I've already removed the seal, and if you look closely, you'll see right there, there's a hole and there's a hole. So this is a ring that we have to take out. Once we have that ring out, we should be able to beat this bearing out of its housing. Right, and there she is. She's out. So now the last thing I need to do is just hammer this bearing out of its seat, and then we can start rebuilding again. So now I have everything cleaned up. You can see this is the stub axle that I got from that friend of mine. It's amazing how well this cleans up. Let me show you what this assembly looks like. This is where the wheel would sit on the car, or the drum brakes. So it starts first of all with this bearing, which is a one that has barrels inside it and not balls. And it shows you the bearing there, and it's also got an inner race which is already inside there. That's why it's packed in a piece of plastic. Then you have a rubber o-ring, which is this guy. Then you have in essence a sealing ring, which is this one, which I don't show on this picture, but it's because the cap fits on top of that. So this keeps all the grease inside the bearings. Then we move on to a spacer, which is this guy, which sits around the shaft. And you can see this one's a little bit worn, but not too bad. And then, don't roll away. Then you have the one with the balls sitting right there. So that's the spacer, that's this guy. Then we have the circlip that I showed you I removed. There's a new one that sits behind that one. And then we have again another seal, exactly the same as the one that sits in the front. And this seal and the seal that sits there keeps all the grease inside that little housing there where the wheel bearings sit. And then the last thing we do is we have this little collar. You can see it's a little bit beveled. This collar that moves onto the shaft like that. And this gives it a clean mating service against the seal. So now that we have all of this cleaned up, and I've got the housing cleaned up as well, it's time for reassembly and to get this into the car. All right, so how you grease a bearing is you put a wad of grease into your hands, and then you just keep on pushing it through the bearing, and you'll see this is what you want to see, that it's pushing through on the other side like this. Then you know you've got enough grease on your bearing, and once you have enough grease on the bearing, we can put it into the housing and we can start building up the rest of the bearings. All right, so I've now got the bearing sitting again flush in the housing, but now I need to drive it home onto where it belongs. The best way to do this is to find a socket that's big enough, but I don't have a socket that size. So what I like to use is the old bearing. So I'm gonna set the camera up so you can see how this works, and then you can follow along. Alright, so as you see, I used the old bearing and this old impact socket, which is just a little too small, but it was enough to just knock this guy home. And you'll know it's home when the sound changes. So it has like a dull tick, 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 and then it turns into a ting sound. It's difficult to explain, but if you ever push in a bearing, you'll know where it's seated. If you're wondering if it's seated, it's not seated. Keep on going. And do not hammer too hard on this thing. They are fragile, they can break. So be gentle as you tick them in, and you'll see they go in quite easily. Now that that's done, we can get the circlip in. And once the circlip's in, we can get the seal in. And if the seal's in, I can push through the shaft. Alright, so new bearings in, new circlips in, and the seal is in as well, so now we can go to the front. Alright, so you can see I've now pushed the stub axle through. It's in the one bearing. You can see the spacer ring sitting on the shaft already. What we are now missing is the bearing that sits on this surface. Okay, so you can see I've got the bearing greased and slid on. It just slides in because you've got that cap that holds it in place. So this is now on. I just need to clean the outside of this surface a little bit, get the O-ring on, and then we'll get the slave cylinder back on the backing plate, and then we'll start building it all up again. Alright, so backing plates back on, slave cylinders back on. I have tightened the whole thing to the hub. Yeah, so the next thing to go on are the brake shoes and the brake drum. So the brake shoes are on, the retaining clips are on, the new springs are on, the handbrake is on, and I have also sprayed and cleaned up the handbrake lever and the spacer bar. That's been cleaned up, so everything is now ready to accept the drum, and I'll show you the drum, which has also been primered. So I'm just waiting for this to dry, and then we can get it on the car. And then I'll do the other side, but that one I will do off camera. All right, the drum is on. You'll see that the drive shaft is still hanging off the back there. I'm not going to hook that up at this point, because the only reason we are doing the wheels now is so that I can drop it onto its wheels, so I can lift the front and measure that inclination on the dorsal. So the last thing for me to do is to twist on this new castle nut and give it a bit of a torque. Alright, so the drum is on, the castle nut's on, it's reasonably torqued up, it's about 250 Newton meters now. It's sufficient for me to have the wheels put back on and get the car onto the ground. So this is where I'm going to end the video. If you like my videos, please hit the like button and please subscribe. And this way you'll know when new content's coming out. I'll try and keep the content coming at least every 1 or 2 weeks. Until the next episode, goodbye.